Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be exploring the legacy of the 17th century Scottish minister Robert Kirk, the Reverend Robert Kirk, who wrote the classic book, The Secret Commonwealth of Elves, Fauns, and Fairies in 1691. My guest is my good friend James Tunney, an Irish barrister who is the author of The Mystical Accord, Sutras to Suit Our Times, Lines for Spiritual Evolution, The Mystery of the Trapped Light, Mystical Thoughts in the Dark Age of Scientism, The Empire of Scientism, The Dispiriting Conspiracy and Inevitable Tyranny of Scientocracy, Tech Bondage, Slavery of the Human Spirit, Human Entrance to Transhumanism, Machine Merger and the End of Humanity, as well as two dystopian novels, Blue Lies September and Ireland, I Don't Recognize Who She Is. James lives in Gothenburg, Sweden, and now I'll switch over to the internet video. Welcome, James. Once again, a great pleasure to be with you.
Great to be with you, my friend, again. I look forward to the conversation.
We'll be talking about the Reverend Robert Kirk and his mysterious, influential book, The Secret Commonwealth of Elves, Fauns, and Fairies. And I suppose right at the outset, it's useful to point out that Kirk took this very literally, even though it's today viewed by many as a work of folklore.
Yes, Kirk writes his book on the Secret Commonwealth, the original Secret Commonwealth, and a lot of people classify it as folklore and put it into the realm then of stories that are shared. And that's a mistake. It's clearly a mistake. And that fact was recognized by people like Andrew Lang in 1893 when he said, well, this is psychical research, or of the type of psychical research. It's not mere folklore because he was testifying, in my view, to his own experience and to others' experience. So he's a witness to a real phenomenon. So there is a problem insofar as a lot of people seek to equate such reports and such testimony with mere fantasy. And that is a mistake. Or mere folklore, as if there is no truth to it. And they put it into patterns and categories and taxonomies. So I would emphasize that he is witnessing a phenomenon from his own perspective as an experiencer, and he is testifying to other people's experience. And the reason why it appeals to me originally was because I recognized the phenomenon and the descriptions as consistent with what I had talked to in Ireland, or the people I had talked to, and what I talked to them about.
Well, fairy lore is understood to be associated with Ireland and Scotland, but I don't think most of our viewers appreciate, or perhaps they do, that fairy lore can be found virtually in every culture.
Well, it's very, very interesting, and there's a few clues of the kind of universality. The Irish word and the word which with derivations in the Scots language. Now, I have to say that in Ireland, we call it Gaelic. In Scotland, it's Gaelic. It's the same language, essentially. People might want to call it two different dialects. Some people claim it's two different languages. It's the same language originally. And he talks about Hibernian, etc. So we're talking about a language which is essentially the same. And in that language, the word for fairies is she. So it's not got to do with fairies, which was a later word, coming associated with France and coming from the continent. So the word we're talking about is she, which refers to a number of things, including the other world, or the mound where it was associated with the fairies. So the Irish and Scottish context is quite unique, but it is very consistent, for example, with the Arabic stories. It's very consistent with Islamic thinking of other beings that exist in the natural world and that are real in that sense. So when you think about the jinn and the genii and the geniuses, even in the Roman context, and if you look at the associations, there's a lot of similarities. The description that Robert Kirk gives of them is consistent with the description of the jinn in relation to, they describe it sometimes as smokeless, or smokeless being, a being made out of a type of smoke, a smoky entity. And these descriptions come up in the Irish context as well, and the association with being underground, and even the idea of the magic carpet is associated in some ways with stories of the way the fairies travel in the wind, and the wind is associated with the fairies. And the ideas, when you see, for example, leaves traveling around in a vortex, when you're out for a walk, it may be the fairies passing by. So there are cross-cultural associations. There's certainly a lot of similarities with the culture here, the ancient culture that's been forgotten about. But there is also, as well, a tendency for scholars to make too much of the connections, because there is distinctiveness, and some areas are more distinct and have a longer tradition and a more persistent tradition than others, and a more coherent tradition. So while it is a universal phenomenon, I'm a bit cautious sometimes to lump them all in the same boat. But yes, this is a universal culture. But it was particularly strong among the Celtic peoples. And because of the fact that Ireland was colonized, for example, from going back to 1169, and it was a process of colonization over hundreds of years, where they weren't really integrated in the colonial experiment, they maintained a culture that was destroyed hundreds of years beforehand in other places.
I think the point that's worth exploring further is the question of, should we regard all of these reports as folklore, or maybe only some of them as folklore, or none of them as folklore? To what extent can we attribute any of these accounts to something more than just folklore?
It's a very good question. You have to put aside a certain category that you have to be skeptical about. As with every phenomenon such as this, there's always going to be some kind of fraudulent, some exaggeration, something which is not real. Someone that wants to tell a story, we can put that aside. Then we have a certain group of people who are interested, for example, who have the second sight. Now, this was the reason why Robert Kirk engaged in this investigation, because the great scientist Robert Boyle was interested in second sight. And that was why that Robert Kirk, who had been involved in translating the Bible from the Irish language into its Scots form, in the Roman form, he then began to investigate the connection between the second sight and the fairies. So there is an idea that the people that interact with the fairies have some gift. And it's interesting, the word she in one spelling is Sidhe, which then corresponds with the Sanskrit idea of the cities. And there may be the implication that you have to be in a certain state in order to see the fairies. And people like Graham Hancock, for example, talks about the link between aliens and fairies, and he links it to being in an altered state. Often for him, that's associated with psychedelics or some other mind-altering substances. But it's clear that certain people who are intuitive can see these things. And the second sight was an idea which was very, very important for scientists as well at the time. People forget that the scientists were very, very interested in these phenomena. And when they're talking about the second sight, or another term is Andá Shala, is another term from the Irish language, they're talking about what we today would refer to as remote viewing, telepathy, extrasensory perception, precognition. All those come within the idea. And also the various esoteric societies that were growing up in the 17th century were very interested in an idea of second sight, which had a number of different layers to it. So there are a certain category of people who have some authority in these domains that have credibility, if you like. So there is, as part of the Secret Commonwealth, there was a letter by Lord Talbot, who went to the Highlands and described situations of people telling what was going to happen in the future. It was very common among the Celts, among the Gaelic-speaking people. Now, you might say, well, why can't we go and find all these people now? Well, a good reason is a lot of the people were cleared out during the Highland clearances. There was an effort to cleanse the land of the native people, the indigenous people, that was going on for hundreds of years. But particularly in the 18th century, there was a clearance of this culture to other lands. So I suspect if you look back at some of the people interested in second sight or in remote viewing in the United States, you'll find that they have a connection back to the Celtic peoples or to the Highlands. So I would also, one last point, Jeff, I would also refer to the first Briton in space, Helen Sharman, who is also a chemist. And she said that she believes that aliens may be among us or probably are among us. And what she suggested, which I agree with, is that we make a presumption about life and the forms in which it takes. Kirk on that is talking about natural phenomena that exist. He's not talking about creatures that only exist in the imaginal world. And his description of faeries as being beings that were like congealed air, which having an astral-like body, reminds me of discussions of plasmates and the extra material of plasma, which of course was discovered by Crookes. He called it radiant matter. There are different forms that we may not expect life to appear in. And recently scientists have been saying, well, plasma can be related to life forms. So perhaps these forms are purely in a different material manifestation that we haven't looked at yet. But if scientists say there can be different life forms on the Earth, and people have been saying for a long time that there are different life forms and they can see them and they have certain behaviors and they exist or move through different dimensions, well, it seems difficult to dismiss them when people like Bernard Carr or many great scientists are telling us about all these different dimensions. So there is something about the liminal zone, moving between different zones and different materials, that lend even a credible scientific basis on which to examine these.
Well, of course, I have just finished writing an essay about evidence for the afterlife. And when we talk about communication with deceased individuals, it's very similar. There is an enormous body of empirical evidence, and yet many people who have a scientific basis, that the only thing that can be real to them has to be something you can touch and photograph in 3 dimensions. So they discount altogether the vast body of evidence for survival of consciousness after death. And I would assume that the possibility of a whole realm of beings, jinns or fairies or elves, is quite comparable to the existence of discarnate humans.
I think that's correct. And the original motivation for Reverend Robert Kirk to put pen to paper and to write The Secret Commonwealth was he had been in London in 1689 supervising the translations of the Bibles, and Robert Boyle, who had financed the translations into Gaelic of the Bible. So Robert Boyle, of course, is a great scientist. He's called a gentleman scientist, but we have to remember that he was part of the colonial enterprise in Ireland. His father, the Earl of Cork, had taken over Walter Raleigh's plantations. So he's from that background. So he had a good context in which to dedicate his time to science. That having been said, he was a very interesting man, and he believed that science and God were not incompatible, and that in fact the exploration of science was totally consistent with the belief in God. That's why he engaged in his scientific experiments. And he is also the leading developer of the experimental method, following on from Bacon. It was afterwards, with Newton, there came a bit of a shift in emphasis. But Bacon or Boyle was interested in alchemy. He was interested in spiritual matters. He had no problem with what is parapsychology. He believed that it should be investigated. And he was the benefactor, if you like, that encouraged the context in which Robert Kirk wrote. Now, Robert Kirk, when he's writing this, one of his motivations is to set up a counter-argument to atheism. Now, this is an important point to remember, and Boyle was concerned with this as well. So when we're talking about atheism in this era, it's not merely people that say, well, I don't believe that God exists. It's people who say, well, God doesn't exist, and therefore there are no other beings that can exist. These were all fantasies and delusions. So what they're criticizing is an ultra-materialist perspective that they recognize as being born at that time, after the Reformation and with the beginnings of the Enlightenment. They understood that an unduly materialistic perspective was leading to a dismissal of a whole range of phenomena, which Boyle would have thought as unscientific, because it meant that people were a priori taking out certain hypotheses. So Boyle worked with a range of people, including Robert Hooke and also John Wilkins. John Wilkins, at that time, who was also a minister, was trying to develop a vehicle which could transport men to the moon. So it's quite incredible. And there had been books or pamphlets written about how to get to the moon. So these were people that were interested in space travel in a serious way. And Boyle was also discovering the nature of air and things that people didn't understand, and other scientific innovations. So they knew that there were invisible forces. And they also thought it was silly to disregard evidence from a whole range of educated and uneducated people to the existence of these phenomena. So there's a number of different forces, and it's here sometimes, in my view, that science went wrong. Something happened in its over-concentration on materialism, which was inconsistent with the idea of experimental philosophy as science was seen at the time.
Well, it's very interesting to me that the title of Robert Cook's book, The Secret Commonwealth, was taken up by the contemporary author Philip Pullman in his a whole series of fascinating novels that have been made into movies. And I know he makes a point in the most recent novel of referring to the physicists of his fictional world as being, I think he used the term experimental theology for what we would call physics. And I think he's hearkening back to a time when the world of theology and the world of science weren't considered separate.
I think what happened is that at a certain time, around the 1700s, that science became solely an instrument of empire for a while, and it continued. And that we can see that viewpoint manifest in Huxley's work in the 1860s, and we can also see a similar counter-reaction with Howitt's book on the history of the supernatural in 1863, where he's trying to counteract a similar view, an ultra-materialist viewpoint. And this idea it continues up to today and leads to, well, scientism in my view. It's nothing got to do with science, because another point that people forget is when Boyle was developing his experimental method, he was using theological ideas to make it work. For example, the idea of conscientiousness and conscience was directly from the Judeo-Christian background. The idea of a scrupulous, transparent experiment was on a theological foundation. And this unwillingness of science, contemporary science, to identify its origins is a bit perverse in some sense. It reminds me, another interesting little intellectual history link with fairies and with this kind of thinking is in the trial of Joan of Arc, where some of the questioning by the clerics were about her association with a fairy tree in the village. And the point has been made by a writer called Karen Sullivan, that the clerics that were educated in the University of Paris, they couldn't have two inconsistent ideas in their head. They have to have a total view of the world which was consistent, and they couldn't tolerate the idea that somebody could be a Christian and maybe believe something else at the same time. So she attributes it towards that semantic Aristotelian kind of viewpoint that you've talked about before, A or not A. And there's a similar thing. Now I believe that we're talking about, in the empire of scientism, we have the Church of Science, where we're talking about authority that you can't counteract. If you don't have a material argument that you can prove, it doesn't count. And this is a deliberate policy. If we go back to the 1860s by Huxley, for example, to dispirit discourse, to take the ideas of the spirit out of discourse. And that was why actually the idea of psychic forces came as a substitute, because it was the only one that would be tolerated in the context of psychic research.
Well, the title, The Secret Commonwealth, implies that the realm of fairies and elves and other sprites and non-physical creatures, elementals, I mean, there's a whole zoo that one might fill with non-physical creatures, but that the title of a commonwealth suggests that they're organized in some fashion.
He says in The Secret Commonwealth that the beings don't have, they may have a king, but they don't have organization in the same way, although they do have tribes and groups. So they're organized slightly different. It sounded slightly more authoritarian. I'm not sure. It varies. But the word Commonwealth, of course, we have to bear in mind the context in which Kirk is writing. In the 17th century was a brutal period in European history. It was a brutal period in Irish history, in Scottish history, in English history. There was a lot of people who, to me, appear psychopathic, who could rely on certain doctrines to enforce what has been described as genocidal policies in these contexts. And then we have the whole era of the Commonwealth with Cromwell. So Commonwealth, the idea is a very particular idea. So that may have informed some of the context of the secret Commonwealth, although it's an older idea. We can go back to Elizabethan period. And the secrecy refers to both the idea that there is something that is hidden that we can't see, and there is also another implication, because we also have a period of witchcraft persecution, and you wouldn't go around shouting about your knowledge about fairies too much. It's quite remarkable that he felt free to do so, because there were still people, men and women, predominantly women, but men as well, being executed for witchcraft. After his death, there was still a man called Aikenhead, I think he was about 20, who was executed in Edinburgh for blasphemy. So we had also the context of the Reformation, and when you're in St. Andrews, where I worked and where the Reverend Kirk studied, as well as Edinburgh, you can see the remains of the cathedral that was burnt down from religious fervour. It was a very, very difficult period. So secrecy was appropriate, and also to indicate that a lot of the secret societies were beginning to form, because, of course, Scotland was very influential in Freemasonry, and there were a lot of people who were exploring those issues in a secret way, and they were integrating knowledge from the community into it. And the Commonwealth referred to the fact, yes, that there is another world, that there is another dimension. So the notion of the otherworldliness that is in existence is clear throughout the process. And hence people can be abducted. And according to the legend, of course, well, not of course, we have there that the Reverend Kirk was abducted, and he died on Doon Hill in Aberfoyle, which is where most of his life was spent, and where he was the minister. And he's found on the Fairy Hill behind the manse, where he used to have a walk in the evening. And they believe, according to Walter Scott, who wrote about his history, they believe he was abducted by the fairies, so he wasn't really buried. There was only stones in the coffin. And that there's a great story about him appearing to a relative who was informed, or to inform another relative to go to the christening, the posthumous christening of his child, and he would appear at the funeral. And this man, Graham of Ducray, had to throw a dagger over the head of Robert Kirk when he appeared, so he would be released from fairyland. Unfortunately, he did appear. He was seen, but Graham was so shocked that he couldn't throw the dagger, and according to the legend, poor old Reverend Robert Kirk remains in fairyland.
Well, that legend brings up an interesting point, which is many people of my generation grew up with an understanding of fairies based on Walt Disney's portrayal of Tinkerbell in Peter Pan. And there's even a famous scene, I think, in the movie where they say, if you believe in fairies, clap your hands. And all the children are clapping their hands so that Tinkerbell can come to life and save Peter Pan. But actual fairy lore is very different from that. Fairies are not always nice and sweet like Tinkerbell.
No, this was a certain Victorian construction, and we have all the Cottingley fairies and all that idea, and perhaps Arthur Conan Doyle was a bit too gullible on some of the issues. So these fairies bear no resemblance to the fairies in real life, if we can say that. And there's a number of features about the fairies that bear remarkable parallels, correspondences with UFOs and abductions. There's often a great sense of disorientation in time and space. And there's an idea in Ireland of the stray sod. If you walk in a particular place, you will get lost. You won't know where you are. You could disappear. You could think you're away for a short period of time, and you won't recognize familiar places. So this distortion of time and space is associated with the fairies. You also have to be careful not to do something that they don't like, because they will, if you mess with them, they will get revenge on you. So I was talking to my aunt who lives in London the other night, and she's nearly 90. And I remember her telling me these stories, and I remember my mother telling me these stories, and my grandfather, years ago. So I was just asking her to see how she remembered them. And she would say, for example, she remembers her brother coming back with wood from the circle, which would be associated with the fairies. And the grandfather says, where did you get that wood? And they describe the place. And he says, well, bring it back straight away. You know, it was a long way away, but you weren't allowed to touch those things. And if you did, if you took something from the fairies, you might go blind, for example. And they had certain well-known remedies against this process. For example, if you're ever going around Ireland in a donkey and cart, Jeff, in the future, when you're enjoying the Highland, and you get lost, and you don't recognize where you are, and you think that the fairies might have led you astray, the solution is to turn your jacket inside out. And that's one of the stories. But actually, I was thinking about that, and the word stroke, according to some people, is linked to the idea of the fairy stroke, or being touched by the fairies. So this idea of disorientation may have described a medical condition, or it may be related to that. And the idea that you can be disorientated, and in fact, God forbid, if someone is having a stroke, if they're able to put their jacket on inside out, it's a good indication that they're thinking fairly okay. We don't have to worry about them. So there are strange connections. But these beings also could abduct you. So you had to be careful. Now, I don't necessarily believe the story about Kirk. I think later ministers may have not liked what Kirk was up to, and or some people may have, I don't know, but there is quite recurrent records of that story. So there may be different angles to it. But this story of abduction is very strong. There's unfortunate elements as well. There was a murder in Ireland, and there were probably more than one, associated with the idea that someone had abducted the being and replaced them in some way, that they were dealing with a changeling. Oh, Jeffrey, that's not him. That's not Jeffrey. He's not himself. And then they might try and kill you to release your spirit. That's a bit dangerous. So we can see problems in that context. But the beings could abduct you. They could abduct women who had given birth to suckle children in the other domain. And there are many descriptions of women going to the different domains, and descriptions of domains of light, etc. There are also there are a range of types of fairies. There are those plasmate ones, if you like, that I was talking about. There are beings that shapeshift, that take the form of people. There are beings that are more like orbs of light, globes of light. And there are beings who are very tall, noble, like humans, but very beautiful and very enticing, very beguiling. So there are a whole range. He doesn't focus on them all. Other people like Evans-Wentz does, of course, who went to Ireland and who talked to A.E. Russell. And he describes a fuller picture of the range of beings that we have. But you can't get away from the associations with some of the stories. Even the stories of people like Whitley Strieber, for example, sound very remarkably consistent with the idea. And also the idea maybe that these beings are living amongst us. They're not necessarily coming down from the craft. Although if you look at the stories of people or races in Ireland associate with the fairies, like the Tuatha Danann, one of their foundation stories was that they came from a craft in the sky. So there are plenty of examples which suggest that it's not a modern phenomenon. There's so many examples of ships in the sky. The idea that it was something that happened in California in the 1950s is a nonsense. It's a very old idea of interaction. But yes, they can be malevolent if you mess with them. There are different types, but generally, Kirk is very, very clear that these are good people, and they're called the Slua Ma, the good people. People think that that's just a euphemism not to refer to them, but people like Kirk believed that they were good, and that they were showing us something. They were showing us about the nature of existence, and he believed that was actually showing us about divinity. But I would suggest he was trying to say that if you accept that these beings exist, well, then maybe you can accept that your own being is bigger than you think it is.
Now, I understand that Kirk's book, although it was written in 1691 as a handwritten manuscript, presumably, that it really wasn't put into print and published until much later. I think it was 1815. So maybe he was being very cautious about what he knew.
He died just after he wrote it. So he's down in London 1689. It's written 1691. He dies in 1692. Now, some people may believe that the fairies didn't want this good information or intelligence to be disclosed. You can make your own mind up on that. So he wasn't around. So they reckon there's about 4 manuscripts at the time. There may be more. So there's a handful of manuscripts. And it was Walter Scott that released it, as you said, in 1813. He published it. And Walter Scott was very, again, a legal background. He was very interested in these stories. He seems to downplay some of them into something like fantasy at times, but he's very well informed about folklore. And of course, we have the letters that he wrote on demonology and witchcraft. So people had to be careful not to venture into the witchcraft domain. So there's a fine line there. But Walter Scott publishes it, and then later Andrew Lang publishes it in 1893. And we also have associations with other associations that emerge through this process. For example, Jules Verne was very interested in Scotland, and he had Scottish connections, and he travelled to Scotland. And he also, like Scott did, travelled to Aberfoyle. Now, Aberfoyle is in the centre of Scotland. It's like in a triangle above Glasgow and Edinburgh, which are very close. And it's on the kind of diagonal between the lowlands and the highlands. It's a gateway to the Trusocks. It's Rob Roy country. So it's again a liminal zone in the not only bilingual, bicameral mind of Scotland in a sense. And Jules Verne wrote a book about an underground, involving a mine and people underground, which was set in New Aberfoyle. So this connection with science fiction continues. And also, Jonathan Swift was influenced by Robert Boyle. And Jonathan Swift, of course, the Irish writer, wrote Gulliver's Travels. So science fiction emerges from this era to some extent, and it's associated with a genuine interest in science and a genuine interest in, I'm not going to call it folklore, in beings like the faeries and beings underground. And that was continued. Bulwer Lytton wrote The Coming Race about the Vril who lived underground, and H.G. Wells and that. So we have this influence on science fiction, which goes back, can be traced in some ways to Kirk. And remember, of course, that, well, Kirk, the Reverend Kirk's father, who was a minister, was James Kirk. And funny enough, who is that James Kirk? He's the man who's in charge of the Starship Enterprise. And also, in Star Wars, we have the Sith, which refers back to, as one of the words he used for the fairies as well. So his influence was probably far bigger than we expect. And of course, in the back of The Secret Commonwealth, the second book, Philip Pullman acknowledges the contribution of the title from the Reverend Kirk, and he said that he stole it. That's the words that Pullman says. One point about The Secret Commonwealth, I've just flicked through it a couple of times. I know a lot of people love the book. And he talks very interestingly about all these different dimensions. But there are some writers who write this type of stuff. I'm not saying about Pullman. And they're talking about fantasy, but they don't believe in any of this. They believe that this is something which is constructed. And it's interesting. I'm not saying this about Stephen King. I don't know enough about his beliefs. But if you look at it, of course, we're talking about an interdimensional being. And if you look at the places, Derry is an Irish word and a place in Ireland, and it means an oak wood or a wood. And we have these translations, if you like, consciously or unconsciously, from this going back to this type of fairy lore, not just in Scotland, of course, but in Ireland, which has impacted on the literary imagination. Disney actually had contacts with Ireland. His family had been in Ireland for a while, and when coming from France or wherever they came from. And he didn't do a lot of research when he came to Ireland and the fairies, and he talked to some people, but he was more interested in his particular view. He was interested in Irish history. He was interested in fairies, but when he's doing his stories about leprechauns and that, he has to make a commercial thing. So it may not represent his knowledge or wider interest in these things.
We have Jacques Vallée, who wrote many decades ago the book Passport to Magonia, a very serious scholarly book looking at the legends associated with fairy lore and comparing them with the reports of people who believed that they had had encounters with non-human aliens associated with what we now call unidentified aerial phenomena.
Jacques Vallée is a very serious thinker that has to be considered. I found myself looking back at his stuff on a number of different dimensions, not least because, from his mathematical background, he was involved in the origins of the internet. And he's also warned against misuse of the internet. He's one of those scientists that have said even though his background, we have to be very, very careful. But in relation to UFOs and aliens, we know about his, and you've released an interview recently, one of your great old interviews with him. But he was seemed quite clear about the connection between these stories and the reports, the constant reports of the phenomenon associated with fairies, and the link with UFOs, or the potential link between them, indicating a phenomenon that need to be studied at least, or need to be considered. And for me, that's what science should be about. It's open-mindedness. And when you use the word aerial, of course, these were creatures that Kirk described. They come through the air. They're associated with the air. They can travel through the air. They can move through the air. And of course, we have in Shakespeare, we have Ariel in The Tempest, who is a creature who is imprisoned in a tree. Some people believe that Kirk was imprisoned in a tree on this fairy hill. But we have that idea. And also Shakespeare in A Midsummer's Night's Dream has Puck, who is related to the Irish puka, who you have talked about with Robert Anton Wilson. So these beings can't be really dismissed when you look at the whole range of ideas. And it's not just a set of stories that have come up. And when you take someone with the mind of Vallée, who is very, very well informed, who's very pragmatic, who's very capable of seeing the negative side of things, he's a very serious thinker, and I believe him, and I share the same view in relation to the correspondences and the necessity to be open-minded looking at these. The idea that we have this strange idea that when we meet these extraterrestrials, that they're going to come in some very old 1970s mechanical ship and arrive down, and we're going to, and loads of lights coming out of it. But it's a kind of old-fashioned view of what intelligence beings will be able to do. My belief is that the more intelligent beings will look much more organic than we thought about, and their ways of interacting will be much more organic, and that we're talking about interdimensionality, the idea that they can move between different dimensions, and there's a whole range of people that you've talked about on these issues that share or are open to those views. Other people, Graham Hancock, for example, talks about a similar view, but Jacques Vallée is certainly a leading figure that we should respect his views in this context, and can speak from a scientific background on the importance of the hypothesis, at least.
Another point that you raised in the beginning of our discussion is the notion of second sight. It might be equivalent to clairvoyance, or it might be something even a little different. I'm not sure, but I believe there have been studies now suggesting that in the Highlands of Scotland, the notion of second sight was rather common and accepted.
The idea of second sight seems to have been very common. Kirk attributes it only to men. Now, there's a very good reason why he would have done that. I think he would have been concerned to protect women from accusations of witchcraft. If you had been in that period, you were not going to go around quoting women who might be tried for witchcraft. So I think that's why he said it was associated with men in particular, although he does use evidence from women. It's clear that men and women had this second sight. There's remarkable stories of being able to see the future. That Lord Tarbert, when he went up the Highlands, he describes the men stopping on occasions, and he's asked them what's happening, and usually there's a story about, I see this, I see the English soldiers coming over the hill, which was funny because no English soldiers, but they did come afterwards. Or I see a dead man in the chair and there is a man hurt and comes in. Or I see a person being carried out in a coffin. Now this was very, very common, and that type of view would have been common in Ireland. That sense of premonition, the sense of clairvoyance, the sense of, he talks about seeing people, the Highlanders seeing their friends in America, able to see. A remote viewing is there as well. So it was there as a gift. It's in relation to the second sight, there was the idea that certain people had it. Of course, one interesting point is that both Robert Boyle and Kirk were seventh sons, and seventh sons usually have are prone to this power. In Ireland, it was the seventh son of a seventh son who got this power, and there are people with certain powers in Ireland still, and healers that still exist, although science doesn't appreciate them so much. And this second sight refers to all the things that you have been talking about in your program for years, and all your work, and it indicates the abilities that we have. It indicates the cities. It indicates that idea of certain skills. How they came about, there can be debate over that, whether people... It did run in certain families. There are certain families that were associated with certain gifts. And figures, for example, in Ireland, like the banshee, and again, she is the same figure, ban is woman. They, and my grandfather tells stories about seeing the banshee. I mean, it's not that long ago, but the banshee was also associated with premonition of death in certain families, in certain places. So there's a very strong tradition of precognition. The second sight could be shared by putting your left foot under the right foot of a wizard and your hand on the shoulder on this. There's certain ways, or there's another tethered hair ceremony, a very complicated one that can help with the seeing things. But they admitted that other people could share these experiences, and certainly around the faeries, it could happen to anybody. In Ireland, it was those ideas weren't associated necessarily with a limited class. They were fairly uniform, that anyone could see them as far as I can tell.
And I understand that Reverend Kirk really writes about his own second sight and includes personal stories in the book, The Secret Commonwealth.
It seems to me that he is speaking about he's speaking in the first person without speaking in the first person. And I suppose he's being a bit cautious because he might run the risk of fingers pointing at him. And he has a particular position, and we don't know about the views of the people at the time. Remember as well that there was great divisions within Protestantism between Presbyterians and Episcopalians, and politics, there was a pendulum swinging. So he had to be a bit circumspect, but it's quite clear. He says that the seventh son has the powers, and that he is a seventh son. So when he's talks of telling who the faeries are and what they are and how they can be seen, that they can be seen at twilight, for example, which is an important point. I think that's underestimated. For example, it seems that we change our vision at twilight, that the body automatically reacts. So the rods and cones change, as far as I remember reading. And there may be that there's a little window of perception which is opened at that time, which is why that we see them, or where the stories are often associated with twilight. There may be some other reason. But it's clear that to me that he's talking about in a first person way. And some of the statements about him after he died, about him and his kind, were suggestive that he was a different type of person. And that, yes, I would say a lot of them are first-hand accounts, but it wouldn't have been wise to refer to them so much. And certainly he does respond or make comments on Lord Tarbot's observations from the Highlands about his experiences, and he seems to be correcting them a bit, or to realign them a bit more consistently with his own views.
Well, we still live in an age where if people report their communication with beings that are invisible or not apparent to other people, they risk all sorts of problems, ranging from social ostracism to perhaps being diagnosed as mentally ill.
For me, there's a very strange aspect of it. If I look at descriptions of contemporary belief in fairies in Ireland, for example, or from people who have done recent studies, it seems quite clear that a lot of people and a lot of young people don't believe in these things. Now, again, there can be different evidence, but it's quite clear to me that scientism has taken over, and I think it's a great loss because we're losing a pre-Christian philosophy, culture, religion, if you like, faith, as Wentz talked about, that is a significant contribution. And also that these beliefs protected the landscape. They were never protected by legislation until the 20th century. But people didn't go near those areas because they were regarded as holy or sacred or having power. So they were protected by cultural beliefs. I believe a lot of them will be destroyed in the next few decades, unfortunately. But when you begin to regard everything as superstition, because it doesn't fit into the present paradigm of science, you're going to lose a lot. It does sadden me because I think it indicates a failure to appreciate the full extent of our own consciousness, to be open-minded to the possibilities that there are a whole range of other phenomena that exist. And when we look back at the really good science, they don't exclude those possibilities. So I think there is a good science and a bad science, and there's good religion and bad religion, good spirituality and bad spirituality. When we get bad science and bad religion, there's a big problem. I believe that good science, and in a proper context, which is not claiming too much, which doesn't drift into scientism, and informed spirituality are going in the same direction. And as I've said before, that if you look at all these figures, for example, like Boyle, they're interested in spiritual light and they're interested in physical light. They investigate things because their curiosity leads them. And spiritual investigation often follows the same symbols in a different way. They look at light. When we're talking about spiritual light, for example, there doesn't seem to be a lot of discussion about the nature of light in other dimensions. If there are all these dimensions, well, how does light behave in these other dimensions? And if we're talking about every spiritual experience of significance at some stage has something got to do with light in it, whether at the stage we're dying, at the stage with UFOs, or internally, or Kundalini, there's light involved in it. Well, perhaps we should think in terms of different dimensions and spiritual light that I've talked about before. So how we can begin to close our mind down and dismiss the evidence of people because we believe that these people were primitive and uneducated like us today is beyond me. I think we have to approach these issues, as good scientists do, with proper humility and proper open-mindedness, and ask, well, is there not something there? If someone who has been to space and is a chemist can say that they believe that aliens are among us or are here, it sounds a bit silly to me for someone that believes they know about science, but is really talking about the indoctrination they've got off television about scientism, that they can dismiss their culture, or they can dismiss these opportunities and not consider the full range and the full spectrum. And even the idea, which is in Islam as well, that some of these figures can possess us, that they could move into our space. It's not inconceivable that some of the ideas associated with possession may in the future be associated with the implication of other material forms that are capable of explanation. So it's a shame. I think we have lost a lot of the people from these lands. We've lost a lot of the culture. The language is disappearing. The culture will disappear. That a great richness is under pressure, and it's under pressure because of scientism, not science. I think science and spirituality, as Jeffrey Kripal says a number of times, can work together very, very well. And I think it's a shame to be so dismissive. It's a shame to not listen to people. It's a shame not to talk to the old people and not to ask them about the stories and what they believed or what they didn't believe, and to get their perspectives and to look back at the records that are there and to begin to approach them with a degree of respect, distinguish what's bad, discern what's useful about it, extract what's useful and apply it in a context. And certainly bear in mind that people today can also have very strange experiences, mystical experiences, and experience associated. It could be associated with electromagnetic changes to the body. We talked about Philip K. Dick, Robert Anton Wills. All those figures have had very strange impacts. And when Robert Kirk is talking about fairies being of an astral nature, we remember that the word astral is associated with the stars. Even in the very conception of the esoteric world, the idea is associated with stars, where we come from in an actual sense, a physical sense, but also maybe where we come from, where other beings come from in an actual sense that science may be able to admit. So I would urge people to have a bit of respect for these things, not to build your roads through some of these things just because there's a bit of superstition about them. You'll get to your places quick enough, and you can travel around them, and we have to protect this culture and be a bit more respectful to it, and not be so dismissive of it.
Well, James, Tunney, once again, this has been a very enlightening, enriching conversation with many, many threads. We could pursue this conversation in a number of different directions, and I know in the future we probably will do that. So once again, thank you very much for being with me today.
Thank you, Jeff, and I'm glad I got the chance on behalf of the Reverend Robert Kirk, who's not here, to reassert the fact that he wrote The Secret Commonwealth, and it's great that other people can be informed by it, but it's also nice if they look back on the work that people did in that context beforehand, and seemingly with a big heart, and it's relevant to today still. Thank you.
And for those of you listening or watching, thank you for being with us.